One of my favorite spiritual teachers is Dr. Wayne Dyer. A big part of why I value his approach to spirituality is the way he approaches the difference between core spiritual principles and the many narratives used to express those principles. He quotes the literature of many spiritual traditions in his programs. That lets him broaden his message so it doesn't feel aimed at one particular group. It also illustrates that there are certain essential understandings that are common to any spiritual or religious narrative. When you embrace a religion or set of spiritual beliefs, you incorporate that narrative, that story, into your own. What's your story? Any spirituality or religion is ultimately a venue for sharing and refining a narrative that ideally facilitates a journey toward our finest humanity and connection with the divine. You can have a deep reverence for the stories and the characters in the spiritual narrative you choose to guide your journey, and at the same time, realize that the point of those stories is the growth and transformation they ought to produce in your life. One of the reasons I couldn't remain a fundamentalist Christian is their insistence on biblical literalism. That's a narrative that feels like it misses the point. Reading the Bible should inspire reverence for God and love for one's fellow human beings. Obsession with strict, legalistic adherence to Scripture turns the Bible into an object of idol worship. That's like picking up a road map to your destination and confusing the map with the destination itself. When Jesus taught the parable of the sower, are we to literally read the words and think that Christ came to offer an agriculture lesson? The word parable itself says the story is meant to illustrate a point that we interpret from its metaphor. Much of what Jesus had to say was intended for contemplation and exploration so that we might see how those values translate into our daily lives. The Bible is a narrative intended to inspire faith, not be the object of faith. It seems to me that any worthy spiritual or religious practice provides a path of personal growth that leads you to greater love, peace, compassion, and joy. If this is the inner destination you've set for your life, then truly what difference does it ultimately make which of the many paths you take to get there? Each of us are pilgrims crossing the theater of experience on our way back to reunion with the divine, adding the whole of all that we have been and everything we've known to that source consciousness. And what does it mean to be a pilgrim, except that you walk from wherever you find yourself in the direction of where you want to go? In seeking to open myself to wisdom from sources other than those of my own religion, I've come to appreciate the way that what really separates one faith from another is not their central values, but simply their narratives. The same messages are woven into different stories, choosing different words, and spoken by different characters. In the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places." This passage is often cited as an expression that there is room within the heart of God for many people. I also believe it means that the heart of the divine is expansive, with room for many narratives that all lead to the same essential place of love, compassion, and acceptance. Realizing that the seeming difference between faiths, each seeking to inspire us toward our finest humanity, is just a difference in narrative, has opened my eyes to the danger that comes from confusing a narrative with the truth. Over the years, I've gotten in some pretty heated discussions with people about religion. For a lot of people, religion has gotten a pretty bad name. Something I've heard pointed out to me many times is the ample history in which countless people have suffered and died as a consequence of religion. At the same time, there are also examples of people who were inspired by their religion to reach out with compassion, forgiveness, generosity, and sacrifice for the sake of others. Sacrifice even to the point of giving their own lives, sometimes for a stranger. The rebuttal to these examples is that it's possible to be compassionate, forgiving, generous, and willing to sacrifice without the need for religion. I agree. But then again, food doesn't have to taste good to nourish the body. Clothing doesn't have to be comfortable to shield you from the elements. If someone chooses to embrace religion as a preferable, more pleasing vision that guides them toward their best selves, where's the harm in that? Some would say plenty. For some, on balance, the harms for which they hold religion responsible outweigh any potential for adding to peace, love, and harmony between people. But is religion itself truly the source of all that suffering? I don't think it is. I think there's a different, more insidious danger often heaped on religion at fault for the violence found in history. The trap of truth. The perilous pitfall of certainty that just one spiritual narrative, or even none of them, can be the one and only truth. Many Christians, speaking from a place of literalism and convinced with absolute certainty in their sole franchise on the truth, often foment hostility and resentment with the way they use their narrative. The 14th chapter of John also goes on to say, Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." This is often taken by Christians to mean that the only route to full union with the divine is by the Christian narrative generally, and in particular, by embracing Jesus Christ as a divine incarnation of God to whom one must pledge obedience. That can be a very exclusionary and alienating narrative, offensive to other faiths. Elsewhere in the Bible, it says, "Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." That's a central point of belief for Christians about the nature of God. God is love. And especially for Christians who accept Christ as God in human form, therefore Christ is love. Perhaps the authentic narrative in the 14th chapter of John is, love is the way and the truth and the life. No one is united with the divine except through love. When you confuse narrative with truth, and then allow yourself the arrogant presumption that your truth is the truth, suffering and harm invariably follows. The legacy of religious suffering has less to do with religion itself than it does with the conceit of certainty in one's own possession of a singular truth, fear in the face of differing narratives, and a lack of humility in the face of the prospect that what one chooses to believe might actually not be the truth. Religion isn't the only arena of human philosophy that often suffers from confusing narrative with truth. A lot of people believe that while religion is about myth, science is about the truth. As a student of science myself, it's become quite plain to me that science, like religion, is actually a search for narratives rather than the truth. Of course, science has very specific rules about how it writes its narratives. Not any willy-nilly story gets enshrined in scientific canon. The narratives of science must be logical, internally consistent, often built upon or even written in the language of mathematics, provide testable hypotheses, and give us the means to reliably explain and predict observable phenomena. But having rigorous rules for the writing of a narrative doesn't make it any less a writing of narrative. My favorite example of this is how we think about gravity. A few hundred years ago, Isaac Newton gave us the tale of the gravitational field. It provided a mathematical way to predict how objects would fall to the earth and gave us a workable metaphor for imagining gravity. It worked very well for a long time. But a few hundred years later, Einstein thought of a better narrative for gravity, one that explained everything that Newton's story did and some things that Newton's story didn't. So we swapped the narrative of the gravitational field for the narrative of curved space-time. It's a better story for sure, one that matches our observations much more closely. But all the same, it's a new story replacing an old story, one myth, if you will, that was traded for a better one. And still newer narratives, like quantum gravity, may soon replace Einstein's. While the story told by science is not arbitrary, it is also not unchanging. Even people who shun religion as myth take as articles of faith things which have been given to them by authorities that they decide to trust. Have you yourself seen an atom? I doubt it, but you probably believe the gospel of the atom delivered in the sermons of science. In fact, when I've gotten into spirited discussions with atheists, one thing they often find infuriating is to point out just how much their system of belief has in common with religion. It is a belief they accept without any proof of its veracity, simply because they like the way the universe looks in their eyes for believing it. They have their prophets, in people like Richard Dawkins and their own hallowed texts. They even meet in groups to discuss and affirm their system of belief. That starts to look a lot like religion to me. They even have fundamentalists operating out of the same dangerous and ego-serving trap of certain truth they denounce in religion. I've met more than a few holier-than-thou atheists in my journey. Even the Rishon-worshipping atheist makes the same election of faith as the religious believer. The only thing that separates the atheist from the believer is the very same thing that separates one branch of believer from another: their choice of narrative, which everyone makes for the very same reason, because whatever they choose allows them to find beauty, order, elegance, and reassurance in their lives. I believe very strongly that whatever religion or spirituality you may choose for yourself, whatever the narrative that speaks to your heart and soul, it should be embraced with the utmost humility, a humility that arises from the awareness that none of us know for a fact what the ultimate truth of existence is, or what the actual nature of the divine, if any at all, may be. I know what I believe. I know why it appeals to me, why it inspires me, how it opens a road that takes me closer to my best and most complete humanity and connection to the divine. But even as I cherish the narrative that makes my life and the universe a thing of wonder and beauty, I know there's a very real probability it isn't the truth. How could it possibly be the truth? How could any mortal awareness, limited by ego and the meager knowledge learned in the flicker of a lifetime, possibly grasp the fullness of the divine? The faith that moves in my life is a thing of tremendous wonder to me, precisely because it lives in the presence of a very real doubt that it could be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that doubt not only makes my faith wondrous in my eyes, it also affords me the humility born from uncertainty, a humility that leaves respectful room for other people to choose a different spiritual narrative from mine without judgment about who is right or which choice is superior. My faith gives me the means to believe what is right for me. My doubt gives me the peace to not fear others who believe what is right for them. And in between faith and doubt, isn't there enough room for everyone to share our common world? I'd like to know what you think about this video. You can write me at the email address on the screen. My thanks to God for this chance to share with you, and may the gifts of love, joy, peace, and enlightenment come to you all.